In Defense Lawyer, James Patterson, the prolific author of crime thrillers, moves into the nonfiction realm with skill equal to the captivating storytelling that draws me among countless others so eagerly to his works. He never disappoints, and this is no exception. Defense Lawyer introduces the uninitiated to Barry Slotnick, a newly minted graduate of New York University Law School, who, driven by the conviction that everyone deserves the best defense, became defender of the indefensible. Whether the client was mafioso or ardent racist mattered not. Slotnick is credited with being the most successful defense attorney ever, whose unparalleled legal brilliance defined a profession, a city, and an era. You don't have to like him, but it's hard not to admire his innovative professional skill. I'll begin with the book's prologue. It was only around 4:30 on a Thursday, but Barry Slotnick had an early dinner to get to in the city before going home to Scarsdale, the affluent New York suburb where he lived with his family, his wife, and of 19 years, Donna, and their 4 children. As Slotnick gathered his belongings, his eyes flitted over the framed illustrations on his walls. Courtroom artists' renderings of Slotnick arguing cases on behalf of a gallery of rogues. His gaze kept returning to the windows. One of the reasons he'd moved here to the transportation building was for the views. From his corner office on the 21st floor, Slotnick could take in a sweeping panorama that encompassed downtown Manhattan, the East River, and the Brooklyn Bridge. It never got old. He said goodbye to his assistant, Pam, and stepped into the elevator. Moments later, he exited the building. Slotnick got cut an impressive figure. He was 6'1" and meticulously groomed, with a distinguished smattering of salt creeping into his neatly clipped beard. Despite the steamy July weather, he wore a tailored 3-piece wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a red power tie. The shirt cuffs, peeking out from the sleeves of his suit jacket, revealed a tastefully stitched monogram, B.I.S. It was a look befitting a man who was, at that moment, the most famous criminal defense lawyer in America. Slotnick stepped out on Lower Broadway. He started to turn right, then glanced at his wedding ring, a trick he had come to rely on. Since childhood, he had a form of dyslexia, and that made him hopeless in distinguishing left from right. By remembering that his wedding ring was on his left hand, he was able to navigate well enough. He turned in the opposite direction and began making his way across the street toward City Hall Park, a shaded plaza where his driver, Roberto, sat waiting to ferry his boss to his next appointment. Slotnick's life was often stressful, but if there was ever a time when the 48-year-old attorney might feel entitled to a rest, it was now, in the summer of 1987. Over the previous 9 months, Slotnick had quarterbacked the successful defense in 2 of the most daunting and controversial trials in memory. First had come the prosecution of John Gotti, the dapper boss of the Gambino crime family, as part of an almost unprecedented legal onslaught against the mafia by the federal government. Just a few weeks earlier, Slotnick had represented Bernhard Goetz, a white electronics engineer who had shot 4 black kids he believed were about to mug him on a New York City subway car in what was called the trial of the century. O.J. Simpson was still just a football star turned rental car spokesman. But instead of resting after those two high-profile cases, Slotnick was busier than ever, carrying an alligator skin briefcase in each hand as he reached the car, a black Cadillac Fleetwood. Roberto popped the trunk from his seat behind the wheel, and Slotnick began putting the briefcases into it. Just then he felt a jolt, a searing sting in his back. The pain was sharp and sudden and had force behind it, like a knife thrust. Turning, Slotnick saw a man in a motorcycle helmet, its dark faceplate pulled down, swinging a blunt object wrapped in newspapers toward his head. Instinctively, he raised his left arm to deflect the blow. The weapon connected with his wrist, sending a shock of pain up his arm and a stab of fear through his whole body. Although Slotnick was an urbane lawyer known for his $2,500 Fioravanti suits, he was not unacquainted with violence. He had a couple of close brushes with death many years earlier, first when a bomb exploded at his office, and then when a client was gunned down while standing right next to him. But Slotnick had never been personally assaulted until right now. He ran into the park to escape, but had traveled only a few yards when the assailant caught up with him, raining blows on his back and arms with the weapon, which Slotnick thought might be a baseball bat with a nail sticking out of it. As bystanders approached, the assailant fled, jumping on a waiting motorcycle piloted by a helmeted accomplice, and sped away. Slotnick stumbled back to the safety of his car, where Roberto apologized for not having been able to help. It had all happened so fast. Roberto had frozen and had only just managed to unfasten his seatbelt. "I think my arm is broken," Slotnick said. "Take me to the hospital." As Roberto drove, Slotnick inventoried the damage. His left hand throbbed. There were puncture wounds to his right arm. His back and arms felt covered with cuts and bruises. And he now noticed that his $15,000 gold Piaget polo watch had been lost in the scuffle. At New York Infirmary Beckman Downtown Hospital, an orthopedic surgeon x-rayed Slotnick's arm and found the fracture. Then Slotnick's nephew Rick, a Wall Street trader and martial arts black belt, arrived at the hospital, having heard about the attack on a newswire. "Oh," Slotnick said, "Karate Boy shows up now." Stuart Slotnick, a rising senior at Scarsdale High, was working the register at Sam Goody in the Galleria in White Plains when his friend Eddie called. Eddie was so distraught he could barely speak. "Your dad was attacked," he finally managed. "I saw it on the news." Stuart immediately called his mother. "Everything's okay," Donna assured him. "His wrist is broken, but he's okay." At the record store, Stuart's manager came up to him and said, "You should call home." "I know already," Stuart said. Everyone at the job knew who Stuart's dad was. And to give you a sense of how ardent his dedication was to his work, this excerpt. For Barry, taking a vacation just meant working in a prettier place than usual. The family went to Florida every year, but even there he would arrange for a phone line to be run to his poolside cabana and would have a receiver perpetually cradled to his ear. Finally, Donna had added an annual December trip to St. Martin on the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin, at a hotel where Barry couldn't finagle a poolside phone. There was no pool. They'd been coming to Little Bay for a few years, but he still felt disoriented without a connection to his office and the daily churn of news and cases in New York. He loved his family dearly, but he felt bored and anxious, not knowing what people were talking about back home. Despite the restlessness, Slotnick was able to return from such respites refreshed and prepared to take on the defense of such infamous mafia crime bosses as John Gotti and New York City subway shooter Bernhard Goetz. This short chapter tells how he got started on that path. When Slotnick arrived at the courthouse, he was wearing his game face. It was May of 1966. The day before, he had received a call from Jacob Kosman, a gruff lawyer in Philadelphia, whose clients included Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa and several organized crime figures, and who was regarded as so brilliant that Supreme Court Justice William Brennan sometimes called to ask his opinion on legal issues. Kosman said he needed someone in New York to help with a matter there. A colleague had told him that Slotnick, not even 27 years old, was a brilliant young appellate attorney, already well versed in local statutes and case law. Now in the hallway outside the courtroom where Slotnick was supposed to meet the client, he saw a short man in a business suit standing by himself. Slotnick asked, "Where's Joe Colombo?" "That's me," the man said. "I'm Barry Slotnick. You're my lawyer." Slotnick had certainly heard of Joe Colombo, who was the reputed leader of an organization that until recently been known as the Profaci crime family. Colombo was in his early 40s, young for a crime boss. His father, Tony, had been a mafioso until he was found garroted in the back seat of his car. Allegedly, Joe had started out running craps games, then became a hitman, then a capo, and finally a boss after he double-crossed Profaci godfather Joe Magliocco and was installed in his place by rival families. The man Slotnick met in New York, though, was quiet and less tough around the edges than the wise guys Slotnick was used to. Colombo had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. For most clients, that wouldn't have presented a problem. Anyone subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury was granted immunity from being prosecuted for anything revealed in that testimony. But organized crime clients were different. Prosecutors exploited all possible loopholes to get convictions against mafiosi, who were maddeningly adept at slipping through the legal net. One of the most helpful loopholes was the mafia's own code of silence. A witness who refused to testify after being granted immunity could be held in contempt of court and sent to prison. Yet mobsters would refuse to answer even the simplest questions on principle. It became a ritual trap for prosecutors to set. "How'd you get to court today?" When the gangsters inevitably said, "I refuse to answer," they'd go to jail for 6 months. This was the situation confronting Slotnick, but he saw an angle. "That's ridiculous," he chided Colombo after the mobster explained that he wouldn't be answering any questions. "They're offering you immunity. How does it affect you to answer questions?" "We don't want to give information." "They're not asking you who you killed. They don't want you to have immunity for anything serious. You're a big gangster. This is a game they're playing." "I'll try it your way," Colombo agreed. This was a highly unusual move, and all the guys were pissed off, Slotnick remembers. Even the prosecutor seemed startled when Colombo started responding to his banal queries. He's answering questions. Ask him about the people he's killed, Slotnick said tartly. Instead, the prosecutor sent Colombo home. It was a groundbreaking tactic and the beginning of the end of that particular prosecutorial gambit. From then on, Barry Slotnick was Joe Colombo's lawyer. Soon he would be one of the small fraternity of go-to attorneys for a whole gamut of jammed-up wise guys. There is no doubt that Slotnick was clever. His imaginative approach to the law managed to introduce a bit of levity to even so serious a career. My personal favorite of his clients is Bullets, Vincent Gigante's dog. Slotnick paced the well of the majestic old courtroom with its oak-coffered ceiling and oil paintings of judges past, and channeled the high purpose and passion he tried to bring to all of his cases. Each case was the most important one he had ever tried. Each case, he deeply believed, was winnable. Each case was an all-out battle of the humble individual against the overpowering state. Your Honor, Slotnick said now, steepling his hands and speaking in the most grave tone he could muster, I stand before you today to prevent a grave injustice. The judge nodded and indulgently. Slotnick was only 25, and he looked even younger. Sitting behind Slotnick in the courtroom was Vincent Chin Gigante. Gigante was a beefy guy with a dark, pomaded pompadour and sleepy-looking eyes. He was an ex-boxer and a soldier in the Genovese crime family. Supposedly, he'd made his bones trying to assassinate Frank Costello, the legendary mafia boss whom tabloids dubbed the prime minister of the underworld. Slotnick had gotten to know Chris's brother, Ralphie, back when he lived in Greenwich Village, close to a luncheonette. It hadn't taken Slotnick long to realize that this wasn't any old luncheonette. There were often stacks of cash lying around. There was a phone no one was allowed to use. There was always knockabout neighborhood wise guys in the place. Their base was a nearby social club, the Triangle Civic Improvement Association, but they seemed to run their bookie business out of the luncheonette. Slotnick felt comfortable around them and sometimes put money on Yankees games with Ralphie. Slotnick was devoted to the Bronx Bombers. Growing up, he and his friends would hang outside Yankee Stadium all the time and try to sneak into home games. When the team lost the American League pennant to the Cleveland Indians in 1954, he'd been too upset to eat dinner. A few days ago, now that Slotnick was a practicing lawyer, Ralphie's brother Chin had come to him about an urgent personal matter, which was what had brought the two men to court today. Right after uttering the words, "prevent a grave injustice," Slotnick paused dramatically, letting a pregnant silence fill the air and casting a doleful gaze at the accused, who, it was being claimed, possessed a known vicious propensity. Then Slotnick turned back toward the judge and resumed his grand oration. "I am here," Slotnick said, "to make sure that a tragic wrong does not occur." Standing beside Slotnick, Bullets, Gigante's German shepherd wagged his tail. Vincent Gigante had undoubtedly done some terrible things in his life, but when it came to bullets, he loved that dog, Slotnick remembers. Bullets would sit all day at the Triangle Civic Improvement Association on Sullivan Street, where Gigante and his buddies sat collecting bets and playing pinochle. Bullets had a nose for undercover police and would start barking like a maniac if he sensed one nearby. Plainclothes cops weren't the only group to whom Bullets took exception. Chin was as racist as Archie Bunker. His daughter Rita would later recall, prone to throwing around epithets such as muleyong, derived from melanzane, the Italian word for eggplant. And Bullets took after his owner. If a black person made the mistake of walking down Sullivan Street, the snarling dog would give chase. Whenever the police received reports that Bullets was at it again, they'd come to the Triangle and ignore the mobsters in search of the troublesome canine. If Gigante knew a police visit was imminent, he'd say, "Go, Bullets," and Bullets would tear off down the street to hide in a neighbor's apartment until his master whistled to let him know it was safe to come back. But a week earlier, Bullets had sunk his teeth into a woman he deemed a neighborhood interloper, and a police officer had come and taken the dog away. If the complainant could show that Bullets had not merely attacked her, but also possessed a known vicious personality, the judge could order that the animal be euthanized. Gigante, desperate not to lose his canine sidekick, turned to Slotnick for help, and the lawyer had demanded a hearing. Slotnick knew that this case wasn't going to be easy. Despite the attorney's youthful conviction that he could solve any legal problem if he just thought long and hard enough, he had, until yesterday, been stumped about how he could possibly save Bullets from being put down. Slotnick might argue that there were mitigating circumstances, that Bullet had had an underprivileged puppyhood or on the mean streets of New York City, say, or that Bullets had been acting in self-defense, but he could not deny that the dog had a rap sheet. This was his third biting incident, or alleged biting incident, as Slotnick emphatically described it. And Slotnick had turned the problem over and over until his head hurt, hoping for a bold inspiration. Now in the courtroom, as Chin glowered in his seat nearby, the victim and a series of police officers who'd had to deal with Bullets in the past took the witness stand. One by one, describing a succession of incidents, they painted a portrait of Bullets as some kind of foaming hellhound. As Gigante listened to the mounting evidence, his customary air of menace became increasingly tinged with what looked like genuine fear. But when Slotnick stood to present a defense, all the attorney's earlier worries had vanished. He felt and looked like he was in command, and he asked the judge to excuse him for a moment. Then he walked out of the courtroom, Bullets trotting along beside him. A minute later, Slotnick came back in. This time, he was holding 3 leashes. Attached to each of them was a German shepherd. The 3 dogs looked identical. When Slotnick reached the front of the chamber with a 4-legged trio, 2 of whom he had borrowed from an accommodating neighbor in Greenwich Village, he turned to the woman who'd brought the complaint against Bullets. "Miss," he said, "can you please tell me which of these dogs bit you?" The woman couldn't ID the guilty dog. Nor could the police officers who'd confidently testified about prior bitings point out which dog had been responsible. This case is dismissed, the judge said, gaveling the proceedings to an end. Slotnick turned to his client and smiled. Chin, with his beloved bullets, returned to him, hugged Slotnick a little too hard. Slotnick named the case The People versus Bullets and dubbed it his first death penalty case. Obviously, I enjoyed Defense Lawyer by James Patterson, and I commend it to you.